The question we have to address is, how could Hashem reward Avram, who is the man of absolute chesed, kindness, goodness, tolerance, gentleness, with the para aduma, which is the symbol of extreme gevura, harshness, strictness, focus, discipline? Doesn't seem to work. And again, even though we're talking about Avram being such a humble person that he's like ashes, and that's the association with the ashes of the paraduma, it has to go deeper than that. It can't just simply be that there's this very superficial association. So the question is, what is chesed? And you have to be, that's not just a question of what is chesed, as in, how do you know if what you're doing is really kind? And sometimes people will debate and say you've got to be cruel to be kind, and sometimes when you're kind, you're enabling, and all that kind of thing. That's not what I'm asking. The question is, when you encounter somebody who's got a tremendous amount of chesed, healthy chesed, they're not extravagant, but they're generous, maybe even to a fault. They're good, they're kind, they're patient, all these wonderful things. You have to ask yourself the question, where's that coming from? And we're going to identify that there are two possible reasons why a person will have a tremendous amount of chesed. So if you have a look at a person like Avraham, you've got to ask, which of the two is the reason he has chesed? Now, in order to be very specific and to be able to explain this well, let's talk specifically about somebody who is very generous. Let's use that as our model for chesed, because it will make it a lot easier for us to understand where that chesed comes from. So you get two kinds of generous people in the world. And it's very interesting, by the way, because anybody who's had any experience with tzedakah, with fundraising, any of those things, you'll know that wealth is not a predictor of charitability. So when we're talking over here about chesed, you've got to ask yourself, where's the chesed coming from? So most commonly, when you think that somebody's generous, you're assuming, well, the reason that they're generous is because they have a lot to give. That's usually what people assume. So somebody's got a lot of assets, and then they're very generous. It kind of makes sense to us. So we call this chesed that is driven by, here's the word, gedula, greatness. In fact, even in the Amidah, when we say that Hashem is Hakel Hagadol, when we say that Hashem is the great God, the commentaries point out that Hagadol means that he shows chesed. So greatness could be a precipitator of chesed. In other words, let's say that somebody's done really, really well in a business deal, and now they've got this massive income that suddenly, unexpectedly came their way because of the degree of success of the business deal. They, at that point, are going to feel gedula. They're going to feel greatness. Not the greatness necessarily of themselves. That's a whole different conversation about what kind of personality they are, whether they're an arrogant person or not. But they're going to feel greatness. They're going to feel that they're in a very empowered position. And often, hopefully, when people feel that they've got greatness in their life, they want to share that greatness with other people. So when a person has had a windfall, when a person's had a great success, when a person is in a position that gives them access to all kinds of resources, so a healthy person will say, now's my opportunity to share. Now that I have these things, I want to give, I want to help. And classically, that is where we identify charity, kindness, goodness. We identify it when a person has many resources, and therefore they feel comfortable, and as a result of feeling comfortable, they're willing to share. Now the problem there is, unfortunately, well, two things. Number one, then you have to wait until they're in that position. If that's what stimulates a person's chesed, then when they go through difficult times, and by the way, difficult times are relative. For one person, difficult times means I don't know how I'm going to put food on the table. For another person, difficult times means they went down from 100 million to 95 million. It's all relative, right? But if the attitude of a person is that my chesed is driven by the greatness, the largesse that I have because of my situation, then when the situation is different, the giving will decline. Or, to put it a little differently, even when they're generous, even when they're giving, they'll say, I have to first ensure that my needs are taken care of. And then, Baruch Hashem, because I have so much excess, that's why I can be so generous. Now, this person is not a bad person, they're level-headed, they're responsible, they're good, they're kind. But the people who learn from them might distort what they're teaching. And the people who learn from them could land up with a twisted version of chesed. So in other words, if I observe somebody and I say, when you are wealthy, when you're in a position of power, when you administer resources, then you can share, that could become something that another person interprets as, you know what, when I have resources, I'm going to share in such a way that lets people know how great my resources are. In other words, there's a subtle difference between the person who's in a good position and therefore they're giving, compared to a person who's in a good position and therefore they're flashing. Big difference. Subtle, but actually a big difference. In other words, you could have a person who's got a lot of money, and as a result of that, they have this beautiful Shabbos where they invite dozens of people to come who might not have a Shabbos of their own. And that is kindness and generosity. And when it gets just slightly twisted by either the people in their circle or other people who observe them, say, oh, when you've got a lot of money, you throw lavish parties, and the next person's going to be throwing a lavish Shabbos dinner, not because they want to look after people who don't have, but because they want to show everybody what a fancy Shabbos dinner they can make. Subtle shift, big difference. So as great as it is for a person to have chesed that is driven by success, it does have its weaknesses. Then there's a much, much less common stimulant for chesed. Much less common. This is the person who has chesed not because they feel the greatness of their financial position or their achievements, etc. This is a person who has chesed because they feel their own loneliness. In other words, this is a person who says, everybody else actually deserves this more than I do. So why am I sharing chesed? Not because I'm a nice person, not because I'm a generous person, not because I feel it's the correct thing to do, that when you are privileged that you should share with others. This is a person whose whole attitude to life is, I'm fortunate, and Baruch Hashem I'm fortunate, but at the end of the day, any other person might very well be more deserving of the good fortune that I have. Now when somebody comes from that perspective, in other words, what's driving their chesed is, they look at you and they say, you deserve this more than I do. That person's not going to only be generous when they're in a robust financial position. This person's going to have chesed always. Now it's interesting, the Gemara says that if a person is approached by a beggar and they don't have anything to give the beggar, then at the very least, you should give the person a smile. Because then at least you give them something that makes them feel like they're human. Makes them feel. So you're always sharing some level of chesed. And that's where this person's headspace will be. Even if I'm not in a position that I can do all these wonderful things that I dream of doing, I will still make an effort to share chesed with somebody else. In fact, it goes more than that. I'll tell you a story. And it's not an isolated story. It's a story that is actually indicative of various people throughout Jewish history. But when we were in yeshiva in Israel, in Kfar Chabad, and we spent, as you know, a lot of time engaging with Reb Mendel Futterfass, who was this great hero of the Hasidic underworld in communist Russia. And he was a tremendous scholar and a very, very special human being. So he once glibly remarked, like he wasn't even trying to make a point about it, it just literally rolled off his tongue in the course of conversation. It wasn't like he was even trying to blow his own trumpet. He just made a comment that when they were trying to keep Judaism alive in Russia, the principle was that you never went to sleep at night with cash in your house. If you had excess, before you went to sleep at night, you gave the money to somebody else who was in need. You didn't know where tomorrow's money was coming from. It wasn't like people were earning salaries. They couldn't work within the communist system. Everything was underground, everything was black market. But the attitude was clear. You don't keep money overnight in your own home because there might be somebody else who needs it more than you do right now. It's an incredible perspective, right? And that's how people lived. That is a different kind of chesed. That's not a chesed that says, it is my responsibility because Hashem has blessed me to be kind to other people. That's not a chesed that says, I'm feeling good about myself. I'm feeling comfortable, therefore I could share chesed with others. This is a chesed that says everybody else is a priority. And so it's not about me. So now you've got to ask yourself the question, which driver of chesed was Avraham's driver of chesed. On the one hand, you could say Avraham was an extremely successful person. He was a very, very wealthy person. In fact, we're told that he was, the Torah even uses the expression that he was kind of laden with livestock. He was an incredibly successful person. So if you look at his story at face value, you could say Avraham showed so much chesed because he could afford to.
But that wasn't in the beginning. He still had chesed right from the very beginning, but he didn't have all that wealth in the beginning.
Well, is that accurate? It's where do we see that Avraham starts his journey of chesed, and where do we see that Avraham starts his journey of wealth? Because Hashem tells him, go out of your father's home, etc., and I will bless you, and I will make you great. And there you have that word again, I will make you great. And we're now identifying that greatness is associated with wealth. And only after that do we start to read about the fact that he accommodated guests and so on and so forth. You could identify other areas of chesed that don't relate to money, but they don't necessarily present themselves before the bracha. So you might want to argue that the reason Avraham has so much chesed is because Avraham has so much bracha in his life. And that might be a reason for us to advocate that when you have bracha, then you should show chesed. But if you're not having so much bracha, maybe you're excused. But that would be completely inaccurate, not because of the timeline, but much more because of the type of chesed that Avraham shows. And that's what we really have to look at. Because the person who's coming from the attitude that says, look, thank God I'm doing nicely, thank God I'm in a healthy position, therefore I feel like I can, should, or am responsible to share chesed, whichever particular psychology a person has. So then, needless to say, you're only going to share in context of what you have. You look at Avraham, on the other hand, he doesn't just share. His chesed is not only represented by sharing. His chesed is so extreme that he actually, as a result of his chesed, puts his own life in danger. That's an extreme form of chesed. So we can see two clear examples of that, one in last week's parasha and one in this week's parasha. Now, this is besides the fact that he's got his open home, which we'll come back to in just a minute. In last week's parasha, his nephew Lot, who quite frankly made a very poor life decision, and that's how he landed up in Sodom. And Avram, who told him right from the outset, we can't live together because we don't share the same values. Wherever you go, I'm going in the opposite direction. In other words, Avram is like kind of distancing himself from Lot. And Lot decides he's going to go live in Sodom, and it's a bad decision, and he mixes with bad people, and he lands up being taken hostage in the midst of this massive regional war. Avram could have said to him, listen, I'm terribly sorry, but I did warn you. I try to keep you in a healthy environment, and you chose to put yourself out there. But Avram doesn't do that. He immediately goes right into the eye of the storm, and he rescues Lot. Now, in order to rescue Lot, he risked his life. That's not just chesed as, I'm going to help you, I'm going to give you, I'm going to support you. That's chesed as in, I'm going to risk me for you. That tells you the attitude. That tells you the attitude is the prioritizing of other people over myself. That's an extreme version of chesed. That's the kind of chesed that makes us feel uncomfortable. That's the kind of chesed that makes us question, is that even how you're supposed to behave? Because we don't want the answer to be yes. We don't want to know that there's an expectation in the Torah that I'm supposed to imperil myself in order to help somebody else. We want to hear that it's all relative and you've got to be responsible. Then again in this week's parasha, Hashem says he's going to wipe out Sodom and Amorah and their sister cities. And Avram says, hang on a second, who are you? Are you the judge of all the earth will not show justice. I mean, what do you think could happen if a person speaks that way to Hashem? But if you just question Hashem at any level in any way, that's a high-risk stake that you're undertaking. It's like anything could happen. Hashem could say, how dare you? And who's he doing it for? He's doing it for the people of Sodom. That shows you how Avram's chesed is extreme. It's chesed even at a cost to himself. Now, the reality is that you could see that in his open home hospitality as well. Because let's say that a person is going to have an open home, and many people do have open homes. You have to really know what you're doing. Some people that no matter how hospitable you are, some people should never come through the door. Right? We've learnt that lesson the hard way, right? That had people over for Shabbos that later we discovered were serial criminals. You have to, even with all your hospitality, you have to take certain responsibility. Now, at the beginning of this week's parasha, we've got Avram talking to Hashem. Who does he go invite into his house? 3 people who appear to him to be idolaters. Now, you shouldn't be letting those people in your house. Idolaters. This is a high-risk game. What are they going to bring into your house? What kind of influence might they have over other members of the household? Maybe they're impressionable children or whatever the case is. It's high risk. But it goes much higher risk than that, you see, because the nature of Avram's chesed is not only that he is willing to risk himself or his physical needs for somebody else, so huge cost, where effectively, if you think about it, the way Avram runs his life is he keeps the bare minimum for himself and everything else is out there in the public. I mean, what do you think it cost to run this whole big hotel that he had in the middle of the desert? And we don't find that he lives lavishly. I mean, they come and he's in a tent, I mean, it's like he had a lot of assets, but he doesn't live a luxurious life because everybody else is the priority. That's one thing. But you know what the ultimate sacrifice is for somebody else? Being willing to sacrifice the things that mean the most to you in life. And to Avram, what do you think means the most to him in life more than anything else? His relationship with Hashem. That's the single most valuable thing that Avram has. Now, at the beginning of this week's parasha, the Torah tells us that Hashem appears to Abraham. So just imagine that for a second. Imagine somebody at this point, we know he's 99 years old. That means he's dedicated a century of his life almost to Hashem. That's all he's done. Whatever Hashem tells him, he does. Wherever he goes, he advertises Hashem. He educates people about Hashem. This is his entire life. Not only that, in mystical terms, we call Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, we call them the Merkava, which means the vehicle of Hashem. In the same way as a vehicle doesn't have a life of its own, doesn't have a mind of its own. The whole point is you've got to direct the vehicle where it should go. So Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are like that. They don't have independence. Whatever Hashem wants from them, that's what they do. They do it automatically. In the same way as you turn the steering wheel, your car turns, hopefully. So in the same way, Hashem wants to go this way, they go that way. Imagine they have an opportunity. Imagine Avram now has an opportunity to experience Hashem at a level of revelation that he's never had before. Hashem has spoken to him multiple times, but here it says something we've never heard before, that Hashem appears to him. That's different. Hashem appears to him. Hashem's giving him time. It's a one-on-one.
What's the word in Hebrew?
Vayera. Vayera, right? Hashem appears to him. So Avram is sitting over there, he's talking to Hashem face to face, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees 3 people who, in his assessment, are idolaters. And he says to Hashem, hang on, I want to just invite them in. When he invites them in, the first thing he tells them is, you have to wash your feet. And why does he tell them you have to wash your feet? Because they bowed to the dust beneath their feet. That's how Rashi explains it, right? They bowed to the dust beneath their feet. Now, in the world of idolatry, there are obviously different types of idolatry. Some of them are a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more subtle. Some of them are a little bit more primitive. And if you want to engage with somebody who has these pagan beliefs, if somebody's got a little bit more of a sophisticated, abstract belief, maybe you have more opportunity to have a conversation with them because at least they're not stuck in the lowliness of the world. But the minute you've got somebody who's bowing to the dust under their feet, basically what that means, they don't even care about spirituality. All they care about is themselves. My feet are like the greatest thing in the world. And I worship the dust of I worship the earth I walk on. If you have people about worship the ground somebody else works, I worship the ground I walk on. There's nothing more antithetical to believing in Hashem than placing yourself as such a central figure. And dust implies obviously the least significant part of life. That's what they bow to. So the last people Avram should ever bring into his home is these people, because you can't even get through to them. Can't even talk to them. You don't even speak in the same language. They don't understand where you're coming from. And yet, he's willing to relinquish his opportunity for personal time with Hashem to go show chesed to those people. That illustrates that Avram is not the kind of chesed that is driven by this greatness, by his success, by his lavish assets. His chesed is driven by commitment. His chesed is driven by value of every other person, that every other person deserves my time, my attention, my goodness, even if it comes at a cost to me. That explains why Avram refers to himself as dust and ashes. He's not just saying, I'm dust and ashes, I'm humble. He's saying his chesed is predicated on that humility. Why does he have chesed? Because he sees himself as insignificant. He sees himself as less valuable than the next person. So he's not the benefactor. Look at me, I'm the philanthropist, I'm the donor, I'm the giver, I'm the supporter. He looks at himself and says, I'm nothing, I'm just here to service. That's what drives his chesed. Once we understand that about the nature of Avram's chesed, then we can appreciate why the two mitzvahs that Hashem gives him as a response to that, or at least gives his children as a response to that, are specifically a mitzvah of ash, and specifically the ash of the Parah Aduma, and specifically a mitzvah of sand, and more specifically the sand of the water of the Sota. Why? Because the Parah Aduma and the Sota both represent that kind of chesed. They are both stories of doing for the other, even at the expense of self, and that's what Avram represents. How they are icons of those, how both of those represent that kind of attitude, well, that we'll have to learn next time.